Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Digimon video. Today I'm going to be doing a retrospective on the complete BT15 meta. But before we get into the English side of BT15, it's usually a good idea to start with the Japanese side, so that way we have a frame of reference in terms of where our meta is coming from, because we right now are in that time lag where Japan is just further ahead than the English format. So in Japan, we do have to note that there is a little bit of a difference when it comes to the level of data that we're going to be working with, where most of Japan's data is going to be coming off of X or Twitter across Asia, and it's mostly of local levels. So there's not really that many large events for us to actually take a look at, calculate, and actually try to break down. So their data collection is just a little bit different. But with BT15, based on the changes to our format versus Japan's format, it makes theirs basically completely irrelevant because they had three top decks that were dominating that format, which was Apocalypse, Anubis, and Melga, and because we got those cards limited for our BT15 format, those didn't have nearly the impact that they had over in Japan, making it so that other decks can rise to the top and fill those gaps. So what does the meta look like now? Well, with BT15 being finished, I can firmly say that this meta was the widest and most diverse in the entire recorded history of the English side of the Digimon trading card game. It follows very similar trends that we've seen in other wide formats like BT13 and BT14. In BT15, we actually had 33 different decks make it into top 16. So yes, this was a longer format, and because it was a longer format, we actually had more room for the diversity to prop up. But the fact that we were even able to get there compared to other formats definitely shows that this format had something special about it to let all of these different decks top. And even though that might seem like a really wide number in terms of all of the different decks that were viable and made it into top 16, if we actually try to condense some of the data down to what actually was the most consistent, we had about 8 to 12 decks make up the bulk of the meta, which still isn't that bad of a foundation for BT15 to be in. So if you're wondering what the actual data spread looks like, this is the complete timeline of events. So there's about 20 events out of BT15. This is all of the different events, all of the different decks, and how many of each deck were able to top and when they were able to top. So feel free to pause and take a look at all of this data if you want to know the baseline and foundation of where the rest of the data that I gathered is coming from. All of this came from Eggman Events, which is a really good collection of data for us to look at and pull from. So if you're wondering about any of the specific lists for any of these decks, those are going to be found there. So after taking a look at that list and organizing it, we can still see a couple of different things. Like right now, the best deck is Numemon, and it's only in the lead by about 2%. So Numemon is right now at 16.88%, or if you just want to round it up to 17, then Numemon makes up 17%, which is a not significant number, considering Mirage is at about 15%, being the runner-up. So Numemon throughout BT15 was one of the most consistent performers, but other decks still were able to go toe-to-toe with it, making it a strong pick and not the only pick. So out of the 33 decks, only about 7 of them had only one topping to them, which put them more into that got lucky category. So as I mentioned before, realistically, about 8 to 12 of these 33 decks are what we actually need to look at, as those are the ones that are topping more consistently, and you can kind of see the percentages on their overall prevalence in the overall meta. So what are the top decks of the BT15 meta? Well, many of the top decks, if we just take a look, are basically the same decks we've been seeing for a while now, and there's a reason why. So the limitation in change made to Anubis, Melga, and Apocalypse all made it harder for those decks to perform like they were in Japan, and those were the three cornerstones of their meta that really shaped and defined what was even competitively viable in that environment. So without those three decks being the cornerstone, this kind of created a power vacuum, but because BT15 wasn't necessarily the most powerful set, because there was still just a lot of decks that were trying to form itself and weren't necessarily complete, or the cards just weren't necessarily super strong in comparison to other decks that we already have had. It just didn't really fill that hyper power vacuum like people would have initially thought, making it so there wasn't really a definitive answer in terms of what was the best deck in the format. So as far as taking a look at the 5 cornerstones for the English meta, that really is just the 5 best decks, which is Numemon, Mirage, Red Hybrids, Deva, and Leviamon. So in terms of looking at the cornerstone decks, I already covered them in the last meta report, so I'm not necessarily going to be talking more in depth about them like I did there and why they're the cornerstones. This time I'm going to be using some slightly different example lists based on the first place lists, because all of the cornerstone decks had at least one first place victory. So Numemon, as far as how the deck actually evolved going into the rest of BT15, the deck can swap between purple and black bases, 2 of the more common bases to play around with, mostly because of their draw engines and their floodgates. The core might be the same, but the deck does tend to utilize different level 3s and supporting level 6s and 7s to really customize it based on the expected meta, making it a highly customizable deck that can handle a wide variety of situations and matchups. Mirage, as far as how the deck actually evolved going into the rest of the BT15 format, Mirage kind of basically just stayed the same because it just uses a few different tech pieces, whether it's trying to gain security attack plus or go into a more removal or anti-tempo focused option base. So the deck really solidified the use of BT13 Mirage to be able to bounce Tamers, which could help slow down specific decks or use evade to try to protect itself and protect cards like Pseudo Ace while helping with its overall setup and still being a decent card to go into with the burst mode. Then Red Hybrids, as far as how the deck evolved going into the rest of the BT15 format, it started to use more Ukamons and Louis for extra aggression to try to speed the deck up and put more pressure onto the opponents because it has extra ways of utilizing its raising or breeding area. They also started to run a little bit more hard removal like Trident Gaia to be able to deal with threats that Emperor Greymon couldn't deal with in some situations, like Fanglongmon in the Deva's matchup, just as an example. Deva's, as far as how this deck evolved going into the rest of the BT15 format, is a little bit more complicated because there actually isn't a whole lot of room for various other tech cards, so it just had the inclusion and wanted to include other strong ace Digimon because your level 5s were already pretty hard to deal with. This just made it so other level 6 ace Digimon were easier to use, like Mega Gargamon, and then you also had the room because you had a lot of different colors on your different ace level 6s to be able to run kind of whatever extra level 7 you felt was needed for the deck to be able to hand up specific matchups. And then Leviamon, as far as how the deck changed and evolved going into the rest of the BT15 format, there was kind of 2 ways to play the deck, and the one that started to be more popular was the one that was utilizing Cerberusmon X Antibody as an extra way to be able to gain more aggression, thanks to Protoform facilitating that type of playstyle, because you're able to reduce the evolution cost going into Cerberus X, and then Cerberus X can then go into Leviamon after spawning that extra body that can then be sacrificed to Leviamon X, which has a lot of DP and Security Attack Plus to really put extra pressure onto the opponent, which has proven over time to be the better version versus the more control-orientated focused version. So I already know that I threw a lot of data at you already, but we have just a little bit more to go over when it comes to looking at the entire format of BT15. So out of the 20 events that we had, it's always important to note what actually took first place and how many times each of the decks ended up getting first place. So in terms of the number one deck that topped the most, that actually wasn't Numemon, even though Numemon was the most represented deck out of all of the top 16s. Mirage actually was the deck that ended up winning the most compared to all of the other decks. So that's for the most part BT15 in a nutshell, and there's a couple of things that we need to be informed about going into BT16. So going into BT16, we're going to be more on par with Japan again, so we actually can start utilizing some Japanese data to try to make some informed decisions on what is going to be popular, prominent, and some tech cards that we want to think about utilizing. So just from the onset, decks utilizing Ukamon, Valkyriemon Ace, and Magnamon X are going to be really strong out of the gate. Ace Digimon are already seeming to be getting stronger, as well as defensive tools, so decks need to start playing around these new aces and these new defensive tools, and that's going to start to try to form a new cornerstone in terms of what's going to be shaping up in the BT16 meta. So I believe the BT16 meta will shrink in terms of the diversity that we've seen compared to the last few formats. So why do I think this? Well, looking at things as of right now, it's because Numemon and Magnamon X are both insanely strong decks and have really powerful cards going inside of those decks that are changing and warping the landscape of the game as we know it. There's a need to actually have answers for those decks and those playstyles in order to be competitively viable, and unfortunately, not all decks actually have answers, which is why I think the format is going to shrink. So, in conclusion, I do think BT15 is the healthiest and most diverse format in the history of the Digimon TCG, having some really strong decks and really good showing of the sheer diversity of decks that we had available to us based on the cornerstone decks that were being played and the overall playstyles. It's not like one playstyle was hyper dominant versus the other. We actually had a really good mix of things. But if you actually want to try to take a look at some of the patterns in BT15 that was really starting to take shape and what allowed certain decks to perform better than others, well, we could kind of chalk it up to three major factors. The first one being Ukamon. Ukamon is just a really good card that helps facilitate more aggressive style plays. You also have training cards, where training cards is just a very powerful consistency tool. So decks that weren't necessarily utilizing training cards that kind of needed them were just functionally slower than other decks that had easier access at utilizing the training cards, which limited their overall performance because they weren't as fast and as consistent as decks with training cards unless they were specifically built and designed to not incorporate those training cards. And then the last big major factor is Ace Digimon. So Ace Digimon is basically the counter mechanic for the game, and, well, decks that actually can utilize the counter mechanic really showed their overall strength because of just how good countering can be based on matchups and the types of cards that your aces were. So while none of these things are exactly bad things to highlight, it still kind of shows that the game definitely is shifting based on these types of cards and their overall existence and impact that they have on the wider scope of the game. But overall, I really enjoyed BT15 as a format, and I hope that BT16 and some of the preceding formats aren't going to try to shrink the overall diversity that the game has, because I do like when the game has lots of diverse decks, because it gives me, the player, more options to play around with, what playstyle I want to play, and how I want to play that playstyle.